Hey, Reality Riffing. Dr. Michael E. Salla came on the show today, and he is really a great internationally recognized scholar in politics, conflict resolution, U.S. foreign policy, and a pioneer in the development of something that I think is very necessary to understand called exopolitics. This is the political study of the key actors, institutions, and processes associated with extraterrestrial life. We talk about current events, we contextualize it in the history of exopolitics and how this kind of understanding is really necessary to be a human on the planet Earth, and looking at the future of exopolitics as well as the future of this planet was just extraordinary with the amazing mind of Dr. Michael E. Salla. Hope you enjoy. Really excited to talk to Dr. Michael Salla, the author of Exopolitics and one of the pioneers of this whole conversation. And really, this book is phenomenal. I'm in the middle of it, but just how this breaks down so many world events and gives you a whole nother kind of view of the politics that are happening. I always say that if you don't understand that these types of politics are happening on the planet, then you basically don't think that there's a federal government, at least in terms of an American standpoint, that there's no federal government if you don't understand the exopolitics. So welcome to the show, and I would love for you just to kind of explain what exopolitics are and give everyone just a kind of fundamental understanding.
Well, thanks for having me on the show, first of all. And yes, exopolitics is really critical because, we kind of accept the idea that, there has been this question surrounding extraterrestrial life and what does it mean? The debate has often been, well, is it real? Is there a government cover-up? And people kind of get fixated on that and kind of get lost in terms of, that debate. But the question is, well, we are so far beyond that debate because, this happened 70 years ago that we first had these incidents that are known to have occurred. And while people can choose to debate that, whether that happened or not, the question that people really should be grappling is, well, what has been happening ever since? What has been happening as a result of this contact that was made of government and militaries getting their hands on retrieved extraterrestrial craft and basically having these interactions with extraterrestrial entities and covering this all up?
Right. And where do you put the kind of beginning of this, just to contextualize it in terms of you're saying first contact was?
Well, I think, we have to look at it both the historical, like the ancient stuff. I mean, the kind of stuff that Eric von Daniken talks about in Chariots of the Gods. So the ancient astronaut theory, that's one place we can start. But, for a really convenient starting point for us is the Second World War.
Right.
Because that's when there really was contact made between both sides in the war. That World War II wasn't just a war between the Allied and Axis powers. In a way, it was a proxy war between different extraterrestrial groups. And that's an amazing thing to think about. It's kind of like we're entering into the realm of Star Wars, where it's like, you have these proxies. But we on Earth, in a way, are like proxies. And you have these different sides, different extraterrestrial groups interacting with the different parties in the war. And, that has continued ever since. So even though we think that the war ended in one side winning, but in fact, you had that kind of continuing just in another form.
Right. And I do think, just in terms of pop culture, which obviously is a reflection in some way of the macro mind and collective consciousness, you're starting to see way more rhetoric in pop culture around the we'll call it the Fourth Reich or Project Paperclip or some of the understanding, and it's written into narrative. Like, one of my favorite shows right now is the time traveler show. about this. I'm forgetting the name right now. That I've been watching. We finished. We were very upset about it, but it was quite a good show about basically the Nazi regime putting some kind of rip in time space, but this is now showing up in terms of their extraterrestrial negotiations and time traveling. This is showing up in Hollywood, so we know that this is part of the collective consciousness in a much bigger way.
Yes, it is. It's filtering into the collective consciousness. There have been a number of shows that kind of talk about this. The recent one was Man in the High Castle.
That's the one. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
So, that's the one where exactly you have this kind of this parallel time stream where the Nazis won the war and basically developed this time travel technology to be able to go into different time streams, and then it moves from being kind of like regular warfare, as we understand it, into temporal warfare. And that for a lot of people is kind of like completely mind-shattering. Like, what in the world is temporal warfare? Well, we can see echoes of that in terms of like the Mandela effect, where all of a sudden people start to notice changes in the timeline, where things that they grew up taking for granted all of a sudden are different. So, for example, in the you have people say that they remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison, and of course, for many of us, what we remember is Nelson Mandela became the first president of South Africa. So, there's these bleed-throughs, and this is the Mandela effect, and that's kind of like a really interesting way of understanding this idea of temporal warfare is very real.
And you're using this term, just I want to make sure the audience is getting it, temporal warfare. Is that the word you're using?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes, temporal.
So this and what you mean, and just to kind of contextualize it, let's say with a virus, that even we'll call it warring timelines or warring agendas that are running on different timelines can introduce things like viruses to the other timeline as a part of biological warfare. Is this something I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, that's one aspect of it, but it goes to show that when you bring in this idea of temporal warfare, we're talking about beings from other timelines who, in some way, can interact into our timeline to bring about changes, and that kind of like it's almost like understanding normal chess, but now you have 3D chess because you have a third dimension. Well, here we have the normal way in which people think warfare occurs in a kind of linear sequence. But if you actually have this temporal warfare, you actually have another way in which war can be conducted by changing timelines. So people, like the whole kind of idea of like the Terminator movies with Arnold Schwarzenegger, where you actually had the Terminator being sent back in time to kill the resistance fighter from the future. So, this is the way in which this temporal warfare can occur. You can actually have people from one timeline with the right technology can intervene to try and change things and try and install like a killer virus.
Right. Just side note that you might find interesting. A fangirl side note is that the trade minister, the really beautiful character in Man in the High Castles, I couldn't remember the name of it. He came to class. He's a friend of a friend, and he came to my class here at Rama, and we were talking. He was just from his end. He was talking that they couldn't get the reason why they didn't do any more seasons was that they really couldn't get the viewers to understand the temporal warfare and really kind of buy into it, which I thought was fascinating just in terms of this conversation and people really understanding that this time-space continuum is not what we think it is.
Yeah, it's a very interesting way to understand things, and because we live with this consciousness that we live in linear time, but in fact we are also living in these kind of different time streams, and there's a kind of multiverse out there with different aspects of ourselves
Right.
are out there, and if we can connect with that aspect, we can actually change the timeline, not only where we are, but in the aspect of the other self. I remember I came across this idea, which was very nicely kind of explained in the Seth material by Jane Roberts,
Yes.
where she talked about this, one of her students actually having this connection with an aspect of himself that occupied during the Civil War, and like a southern soldier, and how by making that recognition and connection, not only did his present timeline change, but also the timeline of that Civil War soldier from the Confederacy, his life changed as well.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that about that material, but that's fascinating. So okay, so if somebody they're listening to this, they've never even considered that there are political agendas and negotiations and warfare that's happening by proxy, that is much more than just two sides or two countries or several multiple countries. Starting with World War II is where we're kind of placing it. What key points do you feel like people need to understand when they're trying to kind of get their head around these exopolitics?
Well, I think one of the key points to understand here is that you actually had this intervention during the Second World War, where you had different extraterrestrial sides working with both the Allied and the Axis powers. And while we think the Second World War ended with a clear winner, in fact, what had happened was that there was just a relocation where basically some of the most advanced technologies that had been developed in Germany, Nazi Germany, had been taken to this breakaway location, or these hidden bases in Antarctica and in South America, and that's where the Fourth Reich came in.
Right.
So you had the idea that the Nazis understood that they could not win, or they could not achieve world supremacy through military force. So they decided to go through this other route of kind of like using covert means and economic means and some of their advanced technologies to achieve this kind of dominance. And so that's where you have the whole idea of the Fourth Reich, where they have outposts in South America and in Antarctica, where they use their advanced technology to go to the moon, to go to Mars, and to use that technology to also try and change the timeline so that we move more down that track of where the Germans actually won the war. So that's the temporal warfare aspect of it. So that's where, if you understand that the Second World War was this kind of like important fork in our history as a civilization, and that ever since there's been this struggle between different groups on one timeline, our timeline, which is to kind of like promote freedom and equality and try and bring about the emancipation of the human condition, and the other timeline, which is all about domination, slavery, and that's the Fourth Reich. And there's been this struggle ever since.
I mean, I was just reading something that Henry Kissinger said in 2009 to the World Health Organization, which was basically a talk he gave pro-eugenics. So I think people just have many people, not saying everyone, but it's certainly in the kind of, we'll call it a certain level of the population. They have no idea that this conversation in this timeline is still incredibly active in terms of eugenics and population control and all of the Fourth Reich type of agendas.
It's very, very relevant because you actually have this attempt to steer the mass consciousness down a path where we can actually introduce more of these ideas that the Nazis perpetuated, which is part of their timeline. Like for example, slavery. I mean, slavery is anathema to our civilization or to our kind of Western mores, but yet it occurs in many parts of the world. There are literally millions of people that exist in conditions that are kind of, if not outright slavery, but that are very close to it.
As well as the human trafficking. I mean, as well as the huge amount of human trafficking on the planet.
That's right. On planet and off planet, because
right.
we are part of a galactic culture, even though we might not accept it, that the mainstream doesn't accept the idea that extraterrestrials are out there. But from their perspective, we're part of a galactic society, and even though we're under some kind of planetary quarantine, that doesn't stop groups coming in here and extracting, hundreds of thousands or millions of people for a kind of galactic slave trade. That's another thing that it can be very challenging for people, that in a way our global civilization is kind of very similar to like Africa in the 18th century, where you had all these colonial powers coming in. Some of them were part of the slave trade and others were trying to stop it.
Right.
And that's kind of like where we're at.
That's a great way of describing it, as well as I love that you say we're on a planetary quarantine. So true. So at least we think we are. And part of this, we'll call it this kind of negotiation in terms of taking, taking humans off planet for whatever different reasons, abductions or whatever you want to call it. This is also a part of the political agenda, and you could say part of the negotiations. I mean, I've heard over and over again that there's been there's a certain amount of number of abductions or trafficking that's allowed in order to keep the peace with different kind of alien, different extraterrestrial agendas. What's your thought on that?
Well, it's a very important point, because when we think of like the big picture, what's happening out there in the galaxy, what's their currency? How do people trade? How do extraterrestrial groups trade? What are the commodities that they're trading? Well, you can think of a number of things, precious metals and so forth, or kind of like very rare heavy metal isotopes, element 115. These things are what people typically think of, but genetics is what I understand, the way I understand it. Genetics is the universal currency.
Right.
That if you have some unique genetic material or a being that is unique genetically in some way, that is an incredible source of revenue for people, and it can be traded. So this is where we get into this whole idea of how the Earth and humanity becomes an incredible resource for different extraterrestrial groups out there. Some of them wanting to trade us as a commodity, and others wanting to kind of like protect us and nurture us and help us achieve our highest potential.
And this also, I think, it just parallels the agenda on the planet in terms of cultivating and collecting medical data, and that's happening, on planet, and obviously a whole nother level of that kind of genetic manipulation and genetic gathering of genetic information and medical information off planet as well. I mean, that's both places.
Yeah, I think there is this kind of element where there are groups out there looking at how genetics respond to different conditions. One of the things that I've always found quite fascinating is the idea that our humanity itself is a byproduct or the result of the genetic manipulations of 22 different extraterrestrial civilizations over the course of the last 500,000 years.
Right.
And so that's kind of like really fascinating, because it means that you have all these different extraterrestrial groups out there that help seed humanity, that play a direct role in the different ethnic groups, in the different ethnicities, in terms of one set of genetic markers being slightly different to another set of genetic markers. So that's how we have the different races or ethnicities on Earth, and that this is kind of like something that extraterrestrials have monitored for over 500,000 years, and they're looking at how we respond to evolving planetary conditions, and that obviously includes things like war, famine, pestilence, and of course now we have this kind of like global pandemic. And so this is of interest to these groups that are watching how our genetics perform. Do our genetics need to be tinkered with or not? For some, I think it kind of comes down to this ultimately for me. For some groups out there, some of the extraterrestrial groups, they look at us as like our genetics are the stuff of a kind of like a universal soldier. So we are being bred as a kind of ultimate mercenary force that can be used in these extraterrestrial wars out there. Another group of extraterrestrials is looking at our genetics and looking at us and saying, well, this group, humanity, has the potential to be the saviors of the galaxy because they have these incredible gifts and abilities that are inherent. So they could really save the galaxy from this terrible future. So that seems to me to be what's happening in the big picture of why the extraterrestrials have been doing these long-term genetic experiments for over 500,000 years.
Yeah. I think that's a very simple definition. Obviously, there's always, I think that's an important thing when you start to expand your understanding of what's happening in life in the galaxy and in the universe and how these are interacting, is that there's always light and dark, or there's always a more dark agenda and maybe a more positive agenda. So this isn't all not all extraterrestrial. It's a spectrum, just like you're dealing with anything else. There's a spectrum of different agendas and different kind of ways of interaction in terms of life in the extraterrestrial or off-planet and on-planet life. So I think it's no different in many ways. Can you talk a little bit about, obviously, every planetary leader, every leader of the kind of nation states and anyone high up in government are completely briefed and very knowledgeable to whatever degrees that they need to be in exopolitics. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect, that this is, all government officials are very well briefed in this, and anything you have to say about that?
Right. Well, this is, again, one of those things that it can be challenging for people to try and understand what is happening, is because the assumption is that the most senior political officials are briefed on these issues. But in fact, what I've learned is that it's not done in terms of position or your kind of like status. It's done on the basis of your capacity to maintain a secret. In other words, if you have a need to know and you can keep a secret, then you'll be briefed. If you can't keep the secrecy, then you're not going to be briefed. So some presidents weren't briefed at all. For example, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. Those are two examples of presidents that during their presidencies were interested in finding out about this, but they weren't briefed at all. They basically were not given this information because they weren't trusted. You have someone like Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, who was given a limited briefing. So his briefing basically consisted of the idea that there are a number of extraterrestrial groups here. Some of them are a menace to humanity. And so that's when Ronald Reagan famously began saying that he spoke to the Secretary General of the Soviet Union about the need for Russia and the United States to cooperate to combat a hostile alien invasion, where he made his famous speech in front of the United Nations in 1987. So some presidents are given a limited briefing, some presidents are given a minimal briefing, and others like George Bush Sr., George Herbert Walker Bush, he knew a lot because he was a former CIA director and a covert operative, so he knew a lot about what was going on.
And do you think his son also knew, or do you think they kept him out of it?
I think they kept his son out of it. I mean, his son was never really regarded as, a very bright person. I think he was kind of like, a bit of a rogue, had this kind of roguish personality and wanted to buck the system. So that's not the sort of person you're going to tell anything to. But because he was a scion of this elite family, the Bush family, where George Herbert Walker Bush was president, his father, Prescott Bush, was a senator and had worked closely with Nazi Germany. So Bush Jr., he was basically supported to become governor of Texas and then to become president, but he was never really given any kind of authority just because he had this kind of very roguish and not cooperative personality, and they didn't trust him.
Yeah, I read Sean David Morton's Sands of Time, and he also in that he talks a lot about kind of Clinton being very uninformed and kind of brutish in terms of these particular subjects, whereas my assumption is that our current president, I think, is pretty well versed. What do you think about this?
Yes, the current president, he's fortunate because he actually has a very strong connection to his uncle, John Trump, who was actually a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology at a time when MIT was involved in reviewing Nikola Tesla's papers for their kind of scientific feasibility and importance, and also in analyzing the Roswell craft debris. MIT was involved in that, and Professor Trump was actually a specialist in the precise area dealing with electrogravitics, which is high voltage electrostatics. So Professor Trump was an expert on Van de Graaff generators. So this was stuff that he was introduced to, during the Second World War. This is John Trump, and so with his nephew, the president, he was given this information about some of the stuff that had been secretly developed, and he's got a lot of kind of white hats within his administration that are trying to push this disclosure agenda forward.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you in what you said to begin with, that, forget about disclosure. There already has been disclosure, and it's whether people want to, it's kind of parallel timelines where it's like either you want to understand what's going, it's what I said in the beginning, either you think there's only a state government and that's what's ruling your life, or you understand that there's a federal government. That's basically the government, that we see, and then these kind of above higher governmental exopolitics and some other things. So I saw that you, in terms of current events, something happened in December that I think is really important for people to understand, December of 2019 in this administration. Can you explain that?
Are we talking about the virus?
No. Wasn't there some sort of level of Navy turned into space disclosure kind of thing that happened?
Yes. Yeah. We're talking about the creation of Space Force.
Yes.
That's a very important development because what you have now is the formation of this new branch of the US military, which is going to get all kinds of authority over all the different aspects of the secret space program activities that not only the US military is conducting, but also different corporations.
Right.
Because this is one of the things that has been a real problem, is that you in the United States, because you have such a decentralized political and military system, and you have literally hundreds of major corporations involved in special access programs that have some connection to space. And because all of that's been decentralized and it's all been run in a kind of very unaccountable, opaque way, the central government hasn't been able to achieve kind of like oversight. So Space Force has been established to basically achieve oversight and control over all the different things that are going on in the secret laboratories that we find throughout the US military-industrial complex to make sure that what's happening in space is not going to be a threat to the US Republic in the years to come. So Space Force has been set up with that charge, and it is also a mechanism for the release of the secret space program technologies that have been developed by the Air Force. And that's all being moved over to Space Force, and we can expect over the next 12 to 18 months that they're going to start to roll out some of these technologies.
Yeah. And so basically, for everyone to understand that this has been happening in secret for a long time, and now, and I would even say that some of the technologies that they're going to roll out are part of negotiations they've made in Exopolitics to get those technologies. Would you agree with me on that?
Yeah, there have been a lot of negotiations that have been going into this, like how much of this technology should be released, how much of the truth should be revealed.
Yeah.
So there's been some kind of like compromise reached where they're going to roll out a lot of these technologies that are going to be life-changing. So you can expect like things like free energy and electromagnetic propulsion systems. You can expect things like a holographic healing, like electrical magnetic kind of healing modalities, kind of like what we saw in the Star Trek series where they had the tricorder that could electromagnetically kind of heal people, that kind of technology does exist, because our body is literally bioelectric, and every organ in our body resonates to the particular electromagnetic frequency. And if it's sick, all you need to do is kind of vibrate that frequency to it to heal that organ. So this is something, these are technologies that are going to be released. So they're going to be life-changing.
Yeah. And in that, you know, I've been doing some interviews of some people who are very, you know, concerned about 5G, concerned about the electrification of the planet, and obviously making connections to that being a part of why this current pandemic is happening. What's your take on that? Knowing, you know, the way you just described it, being that there's this kind of electromagnetic technology that's actually, you know, for healing and all sorts of like much kind of like the positive side of the electromagnetic tech. I mean, what do you think about this 5G and some of these theories?
Yes, well, that's a really important issue, because the thing is, electromagnetic technology can be used for both good and bad purposes.
Right.
You know, the good purposes have been kind of like placed in these classified programs, and we haven't really seen that. But we've started to see some of the negative purposes, like, for example, using millimeter waves. This is part of the active denial system, where they transmit electromagnetic waves where you literally feel as though you're on fire. Right. So that can be used as a crowd suppressant or a means of terrorizing a population. Now, the problem with 5G is that because it uses the kind of the same, you're transmitting in the gigahertz wavelengths, that's the same as what's used in active denial systems. So of course, with the 5G system that they want to implement in cities and also transmit from space, they want to kind of like transmit at a very low power. But if you step up the power, you convert what is ostensibly a very fast communication system into an active denial system. And it really is just a matter of just amping up the power, and 5G can be converted into a very effective weapons system that can be used to really terrorize a population and to be transmitted from space. So this is really worrying. We really need to be very aware of exactly what the real goal of placing all those 5G satellites in space is, and how there is a kind of fine line between, you know, what can be a helpful communication system to what can be a very dangerous kind of crowd suppressant system.
Right. And what do you think in terms of, I mean, also obviously the positive that there is, I mean, I personally think this is just the beginning of these kind of quantum electrifications of the planet, and I have to believe that the human is adaptable. I'm a practitioner of Kundalini technology, and when you get the Kundalini moving in the system, your electromagnetic field can handle more. So I have direct experience with that, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are in terms of the positive side of some of this kind of quantum electromagnetic frequencies and how they can be used in other ways positively.
Well, that's really the critical thing, is like how we as individuals can respond to this, because we can't stop, Elon Musk and China establishing these satellite systems up there to transmit 5G. We can't stop the 5G transmitters being placed in our kind of neighborhoods. So what can we do? And I think the work you do is really very critical to this, like that, generating that Kundalini awakening so that our own kind of auric fields can be strengthened. That's going to protect us.
Yeah.
And I think that ultimately is where we are going to move, or where people are going to have to make a choice. Are you just going to be passive and just kind of try and wing it, as all of these powerful electromagnetic technologies are deployed and your body's being buffeted without you knowing it, and these kind of killer viruses start to manifest because they're being triggered by all of these electromagnetic energies? Or are you going to be proactive and basically do the work to try to raise your consciousness, strengthen your auric field, raise the Kundalini? Because I think that's the kind of basic choice people have. You can either be proactive and do something about it, or just be reactive and try and wing it when all this stuff comes down at you.
Yeah. And so now, this brings us to obviously the current state. I know that there was something else that you said that happened in February in the Exopolitics, the U.S. Air Force Association's Air Warforce Symposium. I'm curious about that, and then also if you feel like any of this is connected to the current pandemic and how this all kind of fits in.
Okay, so that's where you actually had Elon Musk giving a presentation at this Air Force Symposium, where he's talking about reusable rockets and how this would be something that would help Space Force. Well, I think that's kind of like really puzzling as to why. I mean, on the one hand, for someone like for someone like Musk and people in the kind of conventional rocket industry, reusable rockets are much superior to kind of like the single-use rockets that NASA and other countries have been using up until recently. But for anyone that's kind of familiar with the secret space programs and their use of electromagnetic technologies, trying to understand, well, why did the Air Force Symposium, why was Musk given permission to speak at that? Why was his information relevant in any way? I think that they're probably cultivating Musk, because one of the things about Musk is that he is someone that is already very familiar with how you can transition an industry. Like, he has been very vocal and very successful in moving us out of a kind of fossil fuel industry, like the car industry, depending on fossil fuels, into electric cars.
Right.
So I think the idea of the Air Force or the Space Force having Trump speak at that symposium was that this is probably the beginning of where Musk is going to start to be briefed on these electromagnetic propulsion systems that have actually having been deployed as part of these secret space programs. And I don't think Musk really knows that they exist. I think Musk probably really does believe that his reusable rockets are like the cutting edge of what's possible. But once he gets the briefing, then he's going to learn about these electromagnetic propulsion systems. I think that's when he's going to become a real force for pushing out that electromagnetic propulsion system ideas and the technologies, and really revolutionize the aerospace industry, just as he's revolutionizing the car industry.
Interesting. I mean, there's always been these series here in Los Angeles that Musk has these kind of Mars jump rooms underneath Sawtelle. There's been like several, more than several. Kind of reports to people who've jumped to Mars that they've done it here in Los Angeles, and it has something to do with Tesla. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, like Andy Basiago and the portals, like in Pasadena, he says that there are these jump rooms. It's quite possible that Elon Musk has heard of this stuff, but he's a very busy guy, and I know he's kind of incredibly focused on having his different companies succeed. And to be able to do that, you need to have your mind pretty focused and pretty motivated. I couldn't imagine him doing what he's doing to kind of make SpaceX successful if he knew that you actually had these kind of like jump room technologies existing, and these kind of like electromagnetic propulsion systems out there existing. I think he probably doesn't know, which is why he's so focused and so motivated to make his reusable rockets successful. Because you just can't, you don't have the time, the bandwidth. But I think at some point he'll learn that they are real.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I've always thought he was kind of read in some way, but was, had to kind of play the market in, whatever. Because he also strikes me, I mean, I think the other part of Exopolitics, which I'm curious what you think about this, but I mean, an Elon Musk, a Zuckerberg, these types, I mean, they seem already that they're quite hybridized humans in terms of some sort of, alien intelligence, or, I mean, whether they know it or not, they even in their kind of their sound current and some of the things that are markers for certain type of humanity, both of them are kind of good examples of being there's a bit of a Borg thing already happening. And I wonder, I mean, what's your thought on that?
Well, there's always that idea that, some of the global elite or people that run the transnational corporations and so forth are these kind of hybrid extraterrestrials. But, then again, we're all hybrid extraterrestrials. I mean, if you go back to that idea of, 500,000 years, 22 different ET races that have been manipulating us. But, you can actually have more recent interventions. I mean, there's no doubt that, more recent extraterrestrial interventions have occurred to genetically kind of like tinker with people, and as a result, all of a sudden, people's IQs shoot up, people's psychic abilities suddenly come online. So that's definitely happening, and so someone like Elon Musk or Zuckerberg or others that are kind of like incredibly successful and kind of like multifaceted in the things that they're doing, quite possible that they were, as children, that they had some kind of like contact experiences and some extraterrestrial groups switched them on. That's very possible.
Yeah. There's also, I'm just remembering this interview my friend did with a woman, and I think she's not the only one, but basically who ends up like with her abduction becoming real kind of lovers with aliens, and remembers it, and it's pleasurable. It's like a whole thing. It's I've heard that rhetoric as well, that there's like a conscious kind of lover situation with some of the abductees. I don't know if you've heard any of this, but I'm just remembering one of these interviews I watched. So what's your kind of take on the coronavirus, any exopolitics having to do with this? I mean, I certainly, when we first got into this quarantine, just unprecedented quarantine situation, the first thing I thought was there has to be some sort of proxy war going on, or there has to be an alien something happening. That was my first thought in terms of why they were keeping us home. What's your thoughts on this?
Well, I think this coronavirus is the bioengineered weapon, and I think it's being basically put into effect by the deep state, and that was because they didn't like the fact that we were heading down a path of transparency and disclosure, that they wanted to kind of like subvert that by coming up with something that would kind of like close things down. But I think what's happened is that this was a pandemic that was planned. The earliest plan I've come across is 2005, where you actually had someone attending a meeting in the city of London, where this idea of a global pandemic starting off in China was discussed, and that was part of a sequence of events.
Right.
But the sequence of events required a nuclear war in the Middle East, but that hasn't happened because there are a lot of good people in the system that prevented that from happening. So it didn't happen. So now you have this kind of bioweapon being unleashed, but it's happening at a time not when the global international system has been weakened because of a nuclear war, but at a time when it's never been economically so robust. So different countries have enormous economic resources to deal with this, that they can shut down their economies for a month or 2 months, even 3 months, and then kind of like come back. And I think this is where you actually have, this last card being played by the deep state to kind of really stop this movement towards a global awakening, transparency, and us moving into this kind of like whole Aquarian age where we kind of like truly step into our power, become less dependent on technology, become more aware of our innate human ability to manifest the reality that we find most joyful.
Yeah. And is this part of this kind of Gaia hypothesis? Can you explain some of your Gaia hypothesis?
Okay, well, the Gaia hypothesis is the idea that was proposed first by James Lovelock. He basically proposed that the idea that the Earth is a self-regulating mechanism, Gaia, and that when the Earth is out of balance, the Earth can self-regulate. It'll bring itself into balance.
Yeah.
And I think that we haven't been out of balance for a long time.
Yeah.
We, humanity, we have not been very responsible stewards for the planet. We have devastated the environment. We've created pollution, and we've kind of devastated the mammalian life in the oceans. And so we've been behaving very irresponsibly. And so there is this self-regulation that is happening with Gaia. And so this is where, you can actually have Gaia as a kind of planetary consciousness playing a role in some of these things that we're witnessing. So these big events, in terms of like viruses, killer viruses suddenly being unleashed, like earthquakes and tsunamis and kind of weather modification changes. All of these things are a part of Gaia, kind of like awakening to try, basically Gaia taking action to help us as a species awaken so that we can be more responsible for how we manage the planet.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that, of course, has not been necessarily accounted for in some of these deep state agendas and exopolitics is that the consciousness of the Earth itself and the like you're talking about, I would describe it a little bit differently, but the subtle body and the power of the Earth itself to create its own electromagnetic power of both protection and self-regulation and consciousness and all of that, I think is not, it's the X factor to a lot of these things in terms of these agendas or more kind of polarized or nefarious or Star Wars type of agendas in the galactic and universal kind of future.
Yeah, I agree. Yes, that's just another way of just understanding the big picture that the Earth is a consciousness, and it's interacting with us through these kind of like events that we're witnessing around us. And the Earth wants us to awaken because it's ready to move to its next level, and that's, of course, people talk about the ascension of Earth, not just the ascension of humanity, but the ascension of Earth.
Yeah, yeah. So just side note, is there any extraterrestrial civilizations that you think particularly are rooting for us? I mean, do you by name, do you go there?
I have talked about that, yes. I think that there are a number of extraterrestrial civilizations. The Pleiadians are one group. Those from the Andromeda star system are another group. We have some from the Tau Ceti, also intervening. Procyon is another. So these are the different star systems that you actually have people talking about these human-looking extraterrestrial groups coming here and helping in our evolution, and that they're trying to kind of like, I think, nurture us so that we can go down this path of becoming an awakened planetary civilization that is in harmony with the Earth and in harmony with, you know, things like the solar logos, that, you know, in harmony with all of that, so that we can then play a role in helping the universe or helping our galaxy break free of a kind of global tyranny. They want to help us so that we can help them do that, because they're stuck. They're stuck in this kind of global they're stuck in this galactic system, which is similar to kind of like Star Wars, where you have this kind of like ongoing set of wars involving these major factions. Yeah. So we're looked at as a possible solution.
And I just interviewed Barbara Henclau, and she was saying that her take is that this exact kind of crossroads of evolution happened in Pleiades on her home planet 125,000 years ago, and that they had to basically do what you're talking about, which is they had to relate to energy differently and electromagnetics, and they were able to kind of get through it. And so that this moment in time is being watched very carefully by off-planet civilizations to see how we're going to do here.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's really important, that we understand that different extraterrestrial groups are looking at us, not so much that we're just kind of like a passive parts of an experiment, but we're also possibly coming up with a solution that can help them deal with their big problem. And they do have a big problem because, as I understand it, the galaxy is kind of like almost like a jungle. It's just like it's definitely survival of the fittest. Yeah. There's incredible beauty in there, but there's also tremendous kind of savagery in there. So, you know, how do you bring that jungle to a kind of like into a state of harmony? And that's, I think, with some of the human-looking extraterrestrial groups, they want that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's important to note, just in terms of the Star Wars, or even, you know, it's been going viral, that Dean Koontz wrote about the Wuhan virus, and also that woman, that psychic, Brown, from she also predicted a 2020 pandemic and this, that, and other thing. But I think it's important to note that I mean, Steven Spielberg actually talks about this, but not exactly in these words. But a lot of times these people who are positioned in kind of these positions in Hollywood, and writers and entertainers, they're actually given off-planet information. They may not know. James Cameron, or James Crowe, who did Avatar. Cameron. He said that whole Avatar came in complete, like it just dropped into his microchip, basically. Like, he had never even thought about something like that before. I mean, that's a good example, and I'm sure George Lucas similarly. They may be being briefed by extraterrestrials, and they don't know it, or they do know it, but this is how this stuff shows up in kind of pop culture, you know.
Yeah, well, that's right. You know, people do get downloads from extraterrestrial groups. I mean, one of the best examples is Nikola Tesla himself, the guy that came up with hundreds of patents. I mean, he was constantly getting downloads. I mean, he had this
Yeah.
eidetic memory, and as it turns out, that he was in fact connected to a group of extraterrestrials from Venus. There's a kind of subterranean civilization on Venus, and he was connected to that. And I think people like James Cameron and like Sylvia Brown, that was the psychic who got the kind of like download on this virus happening at some point that would kind of like hit the planet in 2020. She actually specified, this was back in 2007 when she came up with that. She actually said in 2020 there would be this global pandemic. It would basically spread around the planet. It would hit for a little while, then it would disappear, then it would be gone, and then it would come back in about 10 years later. So, yeah, I mean, I think people like that, you know, either they're kind of tapping into the collective unconsciousness of the planet, of humanity, and they're getting that information, or they're being given direct download from visiting extraterrestrial groups that want to seed this information to humanity. So, you know, Hollywood and kind of like books, literature, these are great ways to like receive a lot of this information that might not necessarily be coming out through the official channels because it's being blocked, but it's coming out a lot through the kind of unofficial channels of Hollywood and kind of like fictional book series and so forth.
Yeah. And I think even, I mean, they show this in The Man in the High Castle, but meditation is a form of time travel, basically. So I think people who have some sort of meditative practice, there's more access to vertical time. So I think that also there's basically time travel that's happening again, whether people understand or know that in that kind of meditative or theta state, you can kind of jump into other time streams.
Yeah, well, that's the critical thing in terms of meditation. You know, I think the bottom line, what we learn in meditation is how to focus our intention, and that's really the key. You know, because anyone who has focused intent, you can do anything. You know, whatever it is that you set your mind to, you can achieve that. So it's all about focusing your intentions and not being distracted, because many of us, you know, we can't hold a thought for more than 3 seconds before something else comes in, taking our attention. So, you know, that's what meditation does. It trains us to focus our intent, and the better we are at focusing our intention and turning it into a kind of laser point of focus, as opposed to a kind of very diffused light that's very weak and doesn't do anything, then that kind of laser focus, we can achieve anything.
It's been so amazing to talk with you. I'm just really, really honored I could talk with you for a long time. This book, everybody, I feel like this is a necessary textbook for human life on planet Earth, called Exopolitics. And when's your new book coming out? Are you writing right now?
I am writing, yes. I have a book coming out next month, April 20th. It's going to be called Rise of the Red Dragon. And so in that book, I look at China's secret space program.
Cool.
So, yeah, that's a book where I talk about China's history with extraterrestrials and how they've been building a space program by reverse engineering these technologies. So, yeah, you can learn about that just going to my website, exopolitics.org.
Exopolitics.org. And where can they follow you on social? Are you a social media person?
Yes, I have a Twitter feed and I have a Facebook feed, so people can join me there. Just look me up, Michael Salla, both on Twitter and Facebook. And I'm kind of I do very approachable. If people want to send me questions and so forth, or contact me, you can do that through my website.
Amazing. And I certainly would love to talk to you again. What day is your book coming out? Can people pre-order it now?
April 20, you can go to Amazon and just enter my name, and it'll come up there for April 20 release. And everything is on Amazon. That's another place to go to, like some of my past books and the one that's coming out.
Amazing. I can't wait to read this new book. And thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your incredible body of work. And thank you for everything that you're doing.
Thank you, and aloha.
Aloha. Nice to meet you. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Reality Riffing. These are conversations that I think are important with people who are doing great things in the world about subject matters that need to be discussed. If you enjoyed the content, the conversation, please feel free to share with your people, share with your friends and family, rate the podcast below, and also subscribe.